You ready to go now?
Mm.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Season 2 of the Shock Absorber podcast, a podcast brought to you by Soul Revival Church on church and the culture. And my name's Joel, and I am here with my co-host, Stu Crawshaw. How are you today,
G'day,
Stu?
Joel, and g'day, everybody. It's good to be here.
It's really excellent to be back. We're finally doing this again.
Yeah.
Held back by a few things, including my wife having another baby.
Which is very exciting.
Yes, it's very exciting. But
and how are they doing?
they're doing really well.
Yep.
Thank you. She is the best sleeper out of all our children. She's our third. So
Yep.
she's been the best so far during the night, which has been really quite nice when it's the third child. So that's been awesome.
Yes. And tell us a little bit about her.
Her name is Remy, and she was born back in August. And so she's just over 6 weeks old. And she's doing really well, feeding well. Like I said, sleeping well is the best thing. And we kind of fallen into having a third child pretty easily, actually, which has
Cool.
been, I mean, we've got a bit of practice with two before, but that's been really nice.
Yeah, it's unreal.
Yeah. Thank you for asking.
You guys seem really happy. It's really good.
Yeah. Well, my wife's awesome. So to be able to do this while she's at home with 3 kids, she's been awesome to allow us to do that. But also she's just she's a natural. She's very, very good at what she does.
Yeah,
I think.
that's cool, hey?
Yeah. Speaking of thank you, we should also say thank you to all the people that have actually listened to this podcast the first season, because we've had over 400 downloads, I think, which has been amazing.
Yeah, I'm surprised.
Just something
It's
that we
massive.
decided to tack together at the end of last year and just have a go at. And now look where we are with
Yeah.
it. It's been really exciting.
It is exciting.
And we've also leveled up. We've got new equipment. We're on video, so
Mhm.
I'm waving to everyone that's on the camera right now. And we've got a nice little sign, so we're pretty excited to get started.
Yeah, looking forward to this season heaps.
Yeah, I'm really excited about it. Now, Stu, you're about to go on leave, unfortunately,
Yes.
well, unfortunately for the podcast, but not for you, because
Yes.
I think it's a well-deserved break.
It'll
yourself?
It'll be very fun.
Where
Yes.
are you off to?
So, me and the family are heading up to Byron Bay. And
very nice.
we're going to just relax, enjoy ourselves. If you're not from Australia, Byron Bay is a really beautiful part of New South Wales on the north coast. Lots of sea and sand, and the hinterland is really beautiful. Lots of rainforest and really cool little communities. Just really looking forward to go for a surf and hang out and enjoy. It's going to be good.
Originally, you were meant to be going overseas, but weren't you?
Yes, but COVID struck.
COVID took care of that.
Yes, so we were very blessed to have the opportunity to have a European holiday. We're going to go to Europe, and we're going to go and check out Turkey. And my wife Louise had organised for us to go to Anzac Day.
That would have been amazing.
So that would have been amazing at Gallipoli in Turkey. So again, if you're not from Australia, that's a pretty important date for us in Australia.
And
Anzac Day.
Were you going to check out some biblical sites?
We
and that
were,
kind of
yeah.
things
We're going
then?
to check out Ephesus, and then we're going to go over to Greece, and we're going to check out Corinth, and
Wow, that would have been
would have
cool.
been really cool.
Yeah, because we were meant to go to San Diego in April
Mhm.
to visit my dad. He lives over in the US, but that didn't end up happening either.
Yeah,
But
right. Yeah.
what have you learnt, obviously being senior pastor of Soul Revival Church, what have you learnt in terms of going through this? It's unprecedented in terms of a pandemic. What's been some of the challenges, and what's been some of the things that have been really exciting, being seeing how our church has had to deal with that?
Yeah, well, of course, as everyone, it took everyone by surprise. It was really overwhelming in the sense that we're really worried about everybody's health, their physical health, their mental health, keeping everyone safe, and also seeking to continue to support people. I actually said to someone the other day, they said, "What's it like being in COVID?" And I said, "Well, imagine yourself as a barista and you're making coffees for people, and then all you can do is video yourself making coffees for people." That's kind of how it felt a bit, because we did digital gatherings and we did really well. But basically what happened when COVID hit was, obviously we were listening to all the instructions from our Archbishop, and the Sydney Anglican Church were amazing in their detailing and helping us to keep everyone safe. And we did have to wait for a while as a lockdown, but straight away we actually did what we've been talking about in the last season. We talked to our young people and said, what do you think we do to face this new challenge? The Shock Absorber was really helpful for us, because it was our young people that said, well, I think we can pull off some digital gatherings. And Joel, you said, I think we can put some of the sermons on a podcast. So we started a new Soul Revival Church podcast, and that had all our sermons on it. And Joel, thank you for all the work you've been doing on that. And we put stuff on Facebook, and we just tried to adapt, I suppose. But in the midst of that, one of the other exciting things was that our youth ministry went around with packs and delivered it to kids, and we also went around to every family in the church and gave them a COVID pack, and just a little pack with some coffee and some chocolate and whatever in it, just to say we love you. But yeah, we tried to keep bringing people, but to be honest, it was a really difficult time and continues to be a difficult time. But in our part of the world, so far, we haven't been hit with a lot of the major implications of COVID. So we've been very blessed, and God has been very kind and generous to us so far.
We've actually been able to go back to doing physical gatherings the last 4 or 5 weeks, I think.
Yep, that's right.
Which has been really cool. Obviously, you've got to do the social distancing, can't do singing.
Yeah, that's right.
But I think for me personally, just you talk about like a mental health thing, to be able to come back to church and see people at church has been awesome.
Yeah. And also our spiritual health. I mean, it's really important for us as Christians to gather. So I think, when we got the heads up that we can get together, we thought, let's try and make that happen as soon as we can. Not rush into it in the sense that we wanted to be silly about it. We put a lot of planning into it, but we did have an urgency, I suppose, to meet back together. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I've been really encouraged that we're still trying to push as hard as we can within the limits, of course, about like what we can do in terms of being able to get people to meet and at least do as many of our services as we can. And kind of thing.
So through the digital gatherings, our young crew were able to put together 6 gatherings a week, which was amazing. And just to continue to hold the shape of our church, because we have 3 different campuses with 6 gatherings in total at the moment, and we're able to do that. And I think they put together something like 105 digital broadcasts, so that was really exciting. We've continued to do that since we've gone back, so that people can still go online if they want to, if they don't feel safe to come back to church yet. But yeah, I suppose we just need to keep trusting in God and continue to proclaim the gospel.
Absolutely. Let's get back into what we kind of like to do with this podcast, and that's the first season. Obviously, we looked at the first 20 years of Soul Revival, and providing a historical context for what informs how we do church now. We kind of, at the end of the last season, led up to you and Matt departing Gymea Anglican Church, but this season will be about looking at how we started started Soul Revival Church, and then we moved on to and how that's kind of played out from 2012 up until now, basically. I thought, as a bridge from what we were talking about at the end of the last season into this season, I thought I could read out your what you wrote in the briefing in 2008. I might just read that again, which says, "This changes the postmodern emphasis on relevance, breaking the rules of modern youth ministry as we strive for more effective discipleship, leading to stronger Christian identity. Church would then become a place where young people are taught to be loyal to Christ, each other, and other outward-looking groups of like-minded Christians. Their heightened community awareness and global perspective will increase their mission effectiveness, giving them clarity and the kind of support that produces continuity in ministry. Such a ministry would become a nexus in the local church for creativity, aspirational direction, encouragement, dynamism, relational depth, fun, and celebration, while at the same time challenging our comfort zones and fostering intergenerational and intercultural relating and identity in Christ." And I thought that was really cool, because obviously when you're starting a new church, that's something that you might like to try and do. How did we do it? And I think that's my first question, but also I know that you also like to kind of bring us a movie. We don't have one today, but in 2012, you're not at church anywhere. What was the decision-making process to start planting the church?
Yeah, that sounds like a good question, a good place to start. So if we think of the question of how do you start a church, well, we were faced with that in 2012, and basically after Matt and I resigned from Gymea Anglican, Matt and I chatted with our bishop, Peter Haywood, who is the bishop of our area, Wollongong, and we were talking to him, and he was encouraging us to think about getting into church planting, and we were asking him heaps of questions about that, and we were surprised when he told us that the area that we live in, the Sutherland Shire, which is in Sydney South, which we were thinking is pretty much a Bible belt, meaning that there's so many churches around in Sutherland Shire that surely that was a place that was well serviced by the gospel. When we were talking to Peter, he was telling us that pretty much only at most 4% of people go to church in the Sutherland Shire. So we were pretty shocked by that, actually. And when you consider the number of churches that there are in the Sutherland Shire, and many have been around for a long time, most of the Anglican churches in the Shire were planted from Sutherland Anglican Church, which started back last century, and then just kept planting churches across the whole area. And the latest church that was planted was Menai Anglican, and that was planted in the late 80s, I think, maybe around that time. So we hadn't done any new ones, but the population of the Shire had continued to grow. So there's about 260,000 people in the Shire and only 4% going to church. So we were also talking, after we left Guymer Anglican Church, we talked to Evangelism and New Churches, which is the church planting department of Sydney Anglican Church. And we were invited to join E&C by a guy called Bruce Hall, who's a terrific, really wise Christian leader, and he's had lots of experience, and he encouraged us to plant in the Sutherland Shire as well. And it just so happened that in Kirrawee, in the Sutherland Shire, a suburb called Kirrawee, they just started to talk about a massive new development, which would pretty much be a new suburb. It was going to be so big, and it was called South Village. It's across the road now from where we are, actually. Yep. But we were encouraged to think about planting a church to that new group that was starting, that new community that would be starting up, and do it in the Sutherland Shire with the Anglican Church, with the Evangelism and New Churches. And what was terrific about that is, even though we weren't given any money or a place to meet, it was really important to us to have the accountability of being part of the Anglican Church still. So Matt and I are both ordained Anglican pastors, but because I hadn't done all of my theological training at Moore College, if we were going to plant a church, then the Archbishop said it was really important for us to have one of us go to Moore College and finish off our study at Moore College. So, I put my hand up to go to Moore College, and I went to Moore College, which is a terrific theological college in Sydney. We're really blessed to have that college, and it's the Sydney Anglican College, so that worked out well. So basically in 2012 I enrolled to start my theological studies again. And so that was a pretty big deal because I was in my early 40s.
Were you stoked on that or not really?
Yeah, I was actually. I was fine with that, yeah. I mean, I was a little bit nervous about planting a church and studying full-time, but I thought we'll give it a go and see how we go. And because Matt and I were doing it together, that seemed to make sense. Our wives, Lauren and Lou, were really supportive. But I like to think of our church plant as a bit of a base jumping church plant, because it's kind of like you jump off the cliff and you hope parachute opens. But we were gonna start in Kirrawee. We joined E&C. So in January we joined E&C, but there was just 4 of us. So that's pretty much how we started. But we were starting with E&C, Evangelism and New Churches, and Bruce Hall was, we were accountable to him for all the things we're going to do. So yeah, we're excited to get a start off. That's how it started.
When the bishop asked you, when Peter Hayward, the bishop, asked you to plant a church, what were your initial thoughts of that? Like, were you very interested in doing it straight away, or is it something you had to really think and pray about beforehand? Yeah, definitely. But like I said, I think I got really interested because he was saying that there were so few people going to church. Yeah. And I've been a part of the Sutherland Shire for a long time, and there's been a lot of really healthy partnerships that I've been a part of in the Sutherland Shire. So we thought if we do something new in the Sutherland Shire, we'd really love to be a church amongst churches and work together with the people around us as well, and complement what was already happening. And like I said, focus on that new community in Kirrawee particularly. Yeah. So then there's you and Lou and Matt and Lauren. Yep. That doesn't sound like a lot of people to plant a church. That's right. What was the kind of next step to do after that? Well, it was really lovely actually, because E&C approached Guymer Anglican Church and said, would Guymer Anglican Church be willing to bless Soul Revival with 30 people to form a launch team? Okay. And so that was great because Guymer Anglican Church said, yeah, that'd be fine. And basically, instead of us asking anyone to come, we thought we'd wait and see who would approach us to come. And as people said that they'd like to come along, Guymer Anglican announced that we were planning the church and that forming the launch team, and basically 30 people approached us. And when we got to 30 people, I sat down with the minister at Guymer Anglican Church and I just said, oh, look, these are the people who've approached us to go. Are you okay with that list? And he said, yeah, that's fine, except for one person on the list. He wanted to talk to that one person, and that was fine too. But then after they
talked, and basically it was great to have the minister's blessing for those people to come, those 30 to come and join us. And so we then had a launch team, and we were able to start meeting. And we actually started meeting in my lounge room in my house.
Yes,
and
we did.
Didn't we, Joel? Because you were one of those people.
Luckily. Yeah, it was not luckily, but yeah, it was an exciting thing to be part of.
Yeah, it was. Hey, so we met in the lounge room, and then we just started meeting in around February, late February.
I can't remember, to be honest.
I think it was late February, March, somewhere around there. I can't remember, but yeah, we started meeting to work out what we're going to do as a church.
Were you like reading books on church planning, or like trying to study about how people did church plants and what kind of was supposedly the best way to plan a church?
Totally, yeah. We started reading during that time. We started listening to podcasts like this. We started to read stuff on the internet. But one of the things that was really helpful was one of the people who came with us, Adam Darvell, who ended up becoming our pastor's warden.
Yeah.
I was talking to Adam one day, and I'm like, oh, church planning, how are we going to start a church? And Adam said, well, we don't know how to start a church, but we know how to do soul revival, so let's do that. And that was probably the best advice I had at the beginning of that time, because we thought, yeah, we've got all these ideas we've had over 20 years that if you haven't listened to the first season, you might want to tap into that first season of the Shock Absorber, because that's a story of all the ideas that came up over that time. And we thought, oh, this is our opportunity to actually do soul revival across a whole church.
And a lot of the ideas for the Shock Absorber were developed through doing youth ministry. How are you translating that to be like a full church? How does that? It's obviously going to be a little bit different.
Yeah,
how did you start kind of trying to translate that into being we don't want to call it, I suppose I wasn't not an adult church, but a church for everything, not just youth ministry.
Yeah. Well, for those of you that might be just tapping into this first episode of season 2, we talked in the last season about this idea of the shock absorber, and we said a shock absorber is like the young people at the church are often on the coalface of cultural change, and they often experience cultural change faster than adults, and sometimes they can be more flexible. And so what we learnt to do as a youth ministry was listen to the voice of young people and include their voice in our planning and in our structures as a church. And so the idea of a shock absorber is that if the church is like a car that's driving through time, every now and again a car comes up against a bump, and the bump in the road, the car goes over that using a shock absorber. But a shock absorber needs to be flexible and strong. So our thought was the young people are the flexibility of the church, and the older people have the biblical wisdom, and they're the strength, the theological strength of a church. So if you can get the young people and the older people to work together as you come across cultural change, as we talked about in COVID, we had our young people say, why don't we do a podcast? And so our young and old actually work together, and our older generations listen to our younger people saying, hey, we think this digital thing might work. So we tried it. That idea of a cultural shock absorber, if you look at it from the point of view, a big point of view, if you step back and get in the helicopter and look, from above, that first 20-year experiment of youth ministry of soul revival was like an opportunity for young people to interface with the cultural change and come up with some new strategies of ministry. And so that's the first part of the shock absorber, the young people coming up with new ideas in the face of cultural change. The second part of the cultural shock absorber is when older people, adults, think through those ideas theologically with the young people, have a conversation with them, and then adapt the adult expressions of the church in line with some of the new ideas that the young people have come up with. So Soul Revival Church Plant, in a way, became the second stage of the shock absorber, if you get what I mean. So the youth ministry was the first phase. When we were younger and we were Gen Xers in the late 90s, we were adapting to cultural change. Over the next 20 years, our young people continued to help us to remain flexible. And so all the ideas, the strategy ideas and the practical ideas we came up with to preach the unchanging gospel, which doesn't change, but the way we interact with our culture often changes. So those new ideas for strategy and practice were the things that we could now put in place in the church plant. So those early days in 2012, we're talking about what are the lessons that we learned in youth ministry in the 90s and the 2000s that we could try and implement across a whole church. So that was sort of how we approached it.
And I think that didn't we start calling that process like a greenhousing?
Yeah, we
way?
did. Yeah, so
That-
those early meetings were like we were workshopping the ideas,
yeah,
but we called it a greenhouse in
yeah.
those
At
days.
the time we called it
Yeah.
greenhouse, but you want to change that wording these days to
Yeah,
workshopping,
yeah,
don't you?
yeah. Well, I think that makes it simplified. But just to think about that greenhouse idea for a moment,
Yeah.
the greenhouse was something we came up with because we were church planting. And when you have a plant, you don't put the plant straight into the garden. You put the little seedling in a little pot, and then that pot goes into a greenhouse. And so you put it under the shade, and it grows, and you water it, and you fertilize it until it's mature. And when it's mature, then you can put it in the garden. And so we thought that the first phase, the first year of Soul Revival would be a greenhouse. Like, let's not rush to have a public launch of the church. Let's think it through. Like, what is our theology? What is our strategy? What is our practice going to look like? And let's grow that idea together before we go to do that. Now, you're right. We now call that a workshop, just to simplify it. And actually, it was one of our pastors in Soul Revival Church this year, Paul, who had the idea to, the greenhouse idea was great, but Paul said, well, you've got this two metaphors going. We've got the greenhouse and a shock absorber metaphor.
Yep.
What if we just use the word workshop? Because that's what you do. You put your car in the workshop, and before you take the car out on the road, you make sure the car's roadworthy. So yeah, from now on, we talk about workshopping. But yeah, in the early days, we talked about it being a greenhouse.
But you also like to use the workshop analogy with a VW
I do.
philosophy, don't you?
Yeah, that's a bit of a quirky thing for me, because my first car was a Beetle,
Yep.
and I thought about Paul's idea about calling it a workshop a bit, and I thought, well, if we take that metaphor and we have a play around with it, and we think, well, when you first get your first car, you don't need to have a big car because you've only got a few people to drive around in. When you first get your Ps in Australia, you get your provisional license, and you just drive yourself around most of the time and a few friends. So you just need a little car. My first car was a 70s Beetle, so I thought, oh, that's cool. And then as your life goes on and your family grows, you get married and you have kids, you get a bigger car. Well, in my case, when I got a bigger car, I was so into 70s V-dubs that I bought a combi van. So yeah, well, we've had a bit of fun with that, which we'll talk about in future podcasts, using those analogies. For the first church plant you do is like a Beetle, a little smaller car. You don't need too many structures to get going, but as you grow, you need to grow your structures, and that will help you to kind of grow your ideas, I suppose. It gives a bit of form to what you do.
Yeah, that's cool. In that time the good thing about this season is that I can actually comment on, because I was actually a big part of actually planning the church. But when we were kind of working out how to obviously do the church, were there any other things that were interesting? I know that I remember Matt brought that the triangle of tradition and culture. Do you want to talk about that briefly?
Yeah, that was super helpful. One day if you can imagine 30 people in a lounge room, and we had butcher's paper on the wall, and Matt got up one day and drew a triangle on the wall, and he said, guys, I think this will help us to focus on what's important as a church plant. And anyway, he drew a triangle, and if you could imagine a triangle, at the top of the triangle he wrote the Bible, and then on the left-hand corner he wrote tradition, down the bottom left-hand corner, and on the bottom right-hand corner he wrote culture. And he explained what he was passionate about was that the Bible is our authority, and the Word of God is unchanging despite the changing culture around us. So we need to make sure we're continually faithful to God's Word, and that's our authority. Then we need to ask the second question, what traditions do we take with us as we start this new church plant? So we talked about the fact that in our Anglican tradition, the way our services are structured are incredibly helpful. The prayer book actually structures a really helpful framework for people to worship God, to come together and to confess their sins, to pray, to read the Bible, to remind themselves of the truth of our creeds, and different parts of the prayer book talk about different verses that are really helpful and encouraging at different times of the year. And then, the reading the Bible is really, really important, because when we read the Bible, it's actually God speaking to us directly. And so the sermon that's really helpful is to unpack that. And, it's also super important for us to sing to God and to praise Him, and also to to pray together. So those sort of traditions, we talked about those and other traditions like the sacraments, the Lord's Supper and things like that. What are the traditions that we really want to make sure that we continue? Because planting a church doesn't mean you throw out everything and start fresh completely. However, we also talked about the fact that we live in a culture in the Sutherland Shire that is changing. And this is obviously what this podcast is looking into. How does theology stay the same, but how do we develop a strategy that helps us to speak that biblical message into the community that we're a part of? And I suppose the third part, theology stays the same. Our strategy can be different depending where we are, but the practice can look different in different parts of the ministry in Soul Revival, as long as each of the practices have discipleship and mission as outcomes for what we do. So yeah, that's sort of what we talked about.
That was the next thing I was going to bring on, the theology, strategy, and practice.
Yeah,
and
cool.
the triangle sounded a lot more like that.
Yeah.
Or a lot very similar to that.
Yeah, yeah.
Can you remember, and this might be trying to delve too far back into the memory, can you remember some of the things that stood out for those 3 points that we were like, yes, we definitely want that to be part of our church?
Yeah, well, again, in season 1 of the podcast, we talked about the importance of being Reformed evangelicals, and for us that was super important. And I'd encourage you, if you're starting a church and you're thinking about church, think about what is your theological basis, like what is your theological community that you're a part of. I mean, we made some pretty big decisions, didn't we? We joined evangelism in new churches, were invited to. I went to Moore College. You know, those kind of decisions were reflections of our theological passion, really. But as a church plant, I think it's really important to have a good, solid understanding of what is our theological basis. Now, I can't remember if we talked about it in the early days or not, but over time we worked out a really helpful phrase to help us to summarize our theology, and that phrase was, Jesus changes everything. And we've got that now on a big poster in our church, and we talk about it a lot.
It's like a tagline.
It's like a tagline, yeah. It's the why of our church.
Yeah.
Why do we do what we do? Because Jesus changes everything. And years ago, we were really convicted by Matthew 22:37-40, where Jesus was asked, what's the most important thing? And he said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and soul. And the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. I'm paraphrasing that. But basically, loving God and loving others is what Jesus teaches us to do, because God obeyed the will of the Father, and he went to the cross for us and laid his life down for us as a sacrifice. And in Romans 12, verse 1, Paul reflects on that and says, in view of God's mercy, offer your bodies as living sacrifices. So we thought, the fact that Jesus died for us on the cross and took away the only barrier that's between us and God, our own sin, and took that upon himself, so that if we repent, we believe in him, repent of our sin, then we have this wonderful forgiveness from God and experience his grace and his peace. And that is just a wonderful new life that Jesus promises us. He says, I've come to give you life and life to the full. So that theological reality of what Christ has done for us on the cross, the fact that he died on the cross and rose from the dead, and then he ascended into heaven and promised his first disciples and us too that he would not leave us as orphans and leave us alone, but send the Holy Spirit to be with us. So he's still with us. We partner with him as he continues to grow the church. And so for us, that theological reality, the gospel is the driving why of why we do Soul Revival. But then when we thought about that, we thought, well, and that was what we were doing as a youth ministry, and we found that an easy transition. But then we asked the hard question of, like, does the strategies of Soul Revival youth ministry work as a church? And I think that's going to be the fun story of this podcast. What translated, what worked, what didn't work, how did we try to implement some of the things that were in the youth ministry across the board? But again, I think we did have this phrase come up pretty early, but we thought of our strategy as our how do we do what we do? So if the reason why we do stuff is Jesus changes everything, then how does Jesus change everything? And how do we partner with him as he changes everything? And we came up with the phrase, share the truth and love of Jesus, person to person, generation to generation, culture to culture, and place to place. So we thought that was a really nice holistic way of saying, let's preach the gospel and share our lives.
I feel like,
and do that with everyone.
Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no, it's all right.
can you unpack that culture, place to place a little bit more? I think people hearing that haven't heard that before. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, sure. So what ended up taking place with our youth ministry was we ended up with an intergenerational aspect to our ministry. So we started as a group of young adults who wanted to become friends with the inappropriate ways with the young people we were leading so they could grow up and become friends with us. We were their leaders first, but then we're also running a friendship group on a Saturday night that our teenagers grew up into. And that became an intergenerational community over many years. And so we called that an all-age, all-stage expression. So when we talked about sharing the truth and love of Jesus, obviously we want to encourage Christians to share the truth and love of Jesus person to person, in other words, one-on-one. But we also wanted them to continue to do that generation to generation. And that was our understanding of let's be sharing the gospel as an all-age, all-stage church. But then when we thought about that, we thought, well, generational difference is not the only difference we want to embrace in our culture. Let's also embrace cultural difference. And so let's be aspirational in our embrace of other cultures. Now, in our area of Sydney, it's not very culturally diverse, but we wanted to be a church for all cultures, not just predominantly Anglo culture, which was what we grew up in. So that's where the culture piece came in.
Was that a choice to do that? Was that a lot to do with what you learnt when you spent so much time with our Aboriginal brothers and sisters? Is that?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think that was a big part of it, because by the time we planted Soul Revival Church, we'd already been friends with Isaac and Eileen Gordon at Brewarrina for 12 years, and their family and their ministry had become part of our family and our ministry. And I think that also, Joel, led to the second part, the place to place, because even though we were Soul Revival Church, we wanted to be a church amongst churches and be supporting and being supported by other churches. And so we wanted to, instead of competing with other churches, we were hoping to become part of an ecosystem of churches. And we wanted to learn from other churches. And we'd learn a lot from the Gordon's ministry. For example, out in Brewarrina, one of the key things that they do at church that had become one of their traditions was that they'd have a meal after church every time they had church. So we'd drive 10 hours out to Brewarrina, which is in northwest New South Wales, and we would have church with them. And then after church, we'd go around someone's house for a feed. And we enjoyed that so much that as a Soul Revival community, we started having feeds with each other more and more. We'd done that a bit in the 90s, but that became more and more a part of what we did as a youth ministry on a Saturday night. So when we started the church, we thought, let's actually take that Aboriginal influence into our church and have that Aboriginal Christianity influence us. So even though we live in the city and they live in the country, we thought we'd take that practice on board. And that was something that really impacted us. And so we thought by putting that in our strategy, what we were doing was articulating that heartbeat to seek to be engaging and being friends with other churches as well, in other places.
And also with the dinner thing, for example, we always have dinner after church, which is awesome.
Which we'll talk about in the podcast to come, like how we do that. Every time we have a meeting, we have a meal almost.
Yes.
And even after COVID, now we've started having our meals again in a safe way.
Which has been amazing.
It has. It's been great. Yeah.
What about if we were starting a church for everyone, or of all ages and all stages? What were the thoughts around kids ministry? Because we still had quite a few kids, even with the 30 people that we were starting the church with. Yeah,
well, a couple of things happened. So to think through that's obviously sharing the truth and love of Jesus generation to generation. Just one thing before we go on to the kids that will help answer that question too is thinking theologically helps us to think about how we do what we do, and then our practice is our what. What do we do? So when it comes to kids ministry, the practice in kids ministry might look a bit different to the practice in some other part of the ministry, because kids will have different discipleship and missional needs. But if we have that desire to have discipleship and mission across all our practice, then that will be really helpful, we're thinking. And so the why and the how needs to affect the practice, but there needs to be flexibility of practice. So with kids early on, we only had a few kids early on, and we sought to make sure that we didn't think of the kids as the church of the future, but we thought of the kids as the church of the present as well. And we started to throw around some really fun, cool ideas about not having the adult meeting and then having the kids meeting separately, but have times where we'd be together around a meal, so we're already getting to know them that way. But we also thought that from time to time during the church, over the year, we'd have the kids be with us in the church. So when we have Christmas, for example, that's a great example of that. But then also on top of that, we came up with this new idea called Kids Chill. And Kids Chill was, what if we actually had a kids teaching time before church starts while people are having a coffee, and then during church, some of the members of the congregation who were safe adults who had working with children checks, things like that, could go and hang out with the kids in their space, as well as having the kids come and hang out with us in our space. And that started some really cool new ways of living as well.
That's the generational interaction that you were talking about. Was that inspired by the Relo Bashes?
Yeah, so back in the first season, we talked about Relo Bashes as a chance to get the whole community together. Basically, in the new church plant, we tried to have a Relo Bash in every week. So every week we'd have a church service and there'd be all ages present. One of the beautiful memories I had, I'm fast forwarding a bit now, but to fast forward a bit, one of the church services we had, my mum, who's in her 70s, one week.
She's the best.
Yeah, Bev. She's got a plate of food in one hand and she's holding one of the young primary school girl's hand in the other, and the primary school girl's got a plate of food in her hand. And she looked up at Bev and she said, "Come on, Bev, you're going to come and have dinner with me tonight because everyone else is always talking about you. It's tonight's just our chance to have dinner together." And so we've just created this space and people fill it with these really cool things that can take place.
That's really cool. What about some examples of other practices that you decided to do? How community groups, for example, or how could we do things like how we're welcoming people into the church and stuff like that? Yeah. How did we come to those decisions to begin with?
Yeah, so how we came up with new decisions on different practices, again, in what we were calling the greenhouse, that we now call the workshop, we're workshopping all these different things before we even started. So each week we take a different topic. So we talk about kids ministry, we talked about youth ministry, but we didn't do anything in youth ministry to start off with because we wanted to look after Guymer Anglican's youth group. So we thought we'd wait a year before we started the youth group, even though we were doing kids ministry. Other practices like community group and things like that, we started thinking, how do we actually come up with a new way of helping volunteers, as many volunteers as possible, be a part of the ministry as we can? And so what we started to do was think up, what if we had different service teams that were headed by volunteers, that volunteer people could join, and what would those different volunteer teams be? And in the early days, I think we had about 8 or 6 or 8, something like that. Yeah, but now we've actually sat around and thought about it even more broadly, and we've got 10 now, which we'll again talk about in a different podcast. But that just meant that right from the very get-go, we wanted to give every Christian an opportunity to serve in the church. And I remember one particular night, Joel, we had a really good conversation, and then afterwards we had a fire at my place around the fire, and some of the people had gone home, and you and me and some of the others stayed, and we just kept talking about it. We got really excited about those kind of ideas. Yeah, we did,
Yeah.
And we got excited about that idea about being on mission together and discipling together,
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's one of my favourite conversations we had in a long time. It was kind of like we were discussing, like, what does it mean to be a soul revivalist kind of thing, like, and be part of that model of ministry. And I think a lot of good things came out of that discussion.
Yeah, it was really cool. So those sorts of things are starting to tumble out, but the real important part was, how do we start to form this up ready to be able to launch the church? And for years, again, as a youth ministry, we used to go away once a year, and we used to call it a week away. And so we went away as a launch team. There was 30 of us went away together, and the week away was the first time we started to make shape. We had a kids ministry. We had we formed an arts team that were pulling the services together. We had the hospitality team, and we started the welcoming team, and we start pulling these things together at that holiday. And from then on, after the week away, which was around the middle of the year, July, so that's kind of how long it took us. We didn't rush. We'd kind of taken our time, and we got to after the week away, and that's when we started to practice. So one week we'd do a church service, and then we'd talk about it the next week. But it was important for us to gather all that information, as Matt had drawn on the triangle. You know, the Bible's our authority, but what are the tradition we want to bring with us, and what are the new cultural stuff we're going to do? The other thing we want to do, which I wanted to mention, is it's really good to go around and see what other churches do. So while we were not going to church every week, we were visiting churches here and there. And my wife Lou, for example, was going around looking at different welcoming ways people welcome, and all that was happening as well. But then after July, that's when we started trying to work out, okay, let's start putting some form into this.
Yeah. Can you talk also about, I remember there was a book that was really influential in us as a church, was The Trellis and the Vine. Do you want to talk about what you learnt from that and how it influenced what we decided to do?
Yeah, well, you asked earlier were there things we were reading. One of the books was Trellis and the Vine by Cole Marshall. And Matt and I actually visited Cole Marshall and went and talked to him. And we said Cole Marshall had done a lot of amazing training over from the 80s, 90s, 2000s. And his book was basically a really exciting summary of all of that. And we said to Cole, like, what do you think about ministry going forward? And he said, guys, the one thing that I think I'd do differently is that we formed up a lot of structures to help get more people to go to Bible college to become ministers, which was great. But he said, I would have liked to have got more people in the local church to have an opportunity to serve. So one of the big messages we got from Cole Marshall and his book was, and Tony Payne's book was, how do we create these spaces, these practical ways for people to serve? One of those ways was through local church training. So he really influenced us with that. And we'd already been doing Berea, which was a local church training. So we continued to make that one of our service teams.
A lot of practice in that already.
Yeah, for sure. So that was helpful. But the other thing that was helpful was Cole had a metaphor as well for ministry, and it was the trellis and a vine. So his idea of the book, if I could summarize it, is basically there needs to be balance with your ministry, that you have your personal ministry, person-to-person ministry, and the structures of your church. So the structures of the church shouldn't get too big and overwhelming, and neither should they be old-fashioned, out of date, and too small. Because if they're too big, the vine won't grow up properly, and if you don't water the vine enough and you spend all your time building structures, then the vine dies. You've got this church with great structures. But then the other thing that can happen is if the vine grows up too big and quick and the structures can't hold it, it'll break the trellis. So that idea of balance was good. And again, as we move towards thinking about this metaphor of the car driving through time, we started thinking, well, if we're going to use the metaphor of a car, we can adapt the trellis and the vine metaphor. Well, the car is the structure of the church, and the people in it is the person to person ministry. And so the bigger your church gets, you need more structures. Hence, you need to go from a Beetle to a Combi, for example. But in these early days, we're still at a Beetle stage, just in the first year. But that trellis and the vine was really helpful, and I'd really thoroughly recommend it. We might put a link to it in the podcast for people to get that book, because Trellis and the Vine is a terrific.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll chuck that in the show notes.
Yeah.
One final question about practice. What were the thoughts around location and where we were going to have our first gathering? Yep,
really big problem for us in the Sutherland Shire, because although there's only 4% of people go to church, the places that have designated places of worship, there's not enough buildings around for 260,000 people. So we're meeting in a lounge room. It's also an area of Sydney that's quite expensive, so real estate was really expensive. And we, as a group of 30 people, were that all the money that we had came from that group of people who were very generous, but that was a real limiting factor in the early days where we're going to meet. I spoke to a friend of mine, Tim McLaughlin, who was from President Avenue Community Church, and they was so super generous, and they let us use their place on a Saturday night, and Tim was very excited about partnering with us in that way. So it was in Kiroi, and that was the suburb we wanted to go into because it's near the development. And so, we partnered with President Avenue Community Church for nearly 2 years as we met in their hall on a Saturday night. So that's where we started to meet. We moved from my lounge room to that church.
And I think that's probably a good spot to leave it in order to look at it in the next episode, which was the influence of Saturday night in doing a church plant. I mean, we started our first service or gathering was on a Saturday night rather than a Sunday night, which is often the way to do it, the way it's done. So we'll look at that next week. Yeah. But the one thing to finish on in the podcast is that we do have a question that's come in. Yeah. And that's from Riley, who is he's planning a church in Parramatta with Sovereign Grace. Yep. So it's really quite an applicable question. But his question was, how do you apply the principles of the shock absorber if you don't have any youth in your church? We started our plant with 30 and the oldest child was 8 or 9 years old. What do you reckon about that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Two things I'd say. First of all, it takes about 5 years to build a culture, I think. So even though you don't have a lot of teenagers in your church yet, if you're a church without a lot of teenagers and young adults, you can still start building that culture of listening to young people. And building that culture can involve things like, well, what we did was kids chill or having dinner where we'd talk to the children, and in a safe way, in appropriate ways, we'd actually help them to be a part of what we're doing as a church. So starting early on with those young people, giving them opportunities to input into the church. As they grow up, they'll get more and more excited to help that process. But the other thing to say is that so many things in church are aspirational. As I said, that culture-to-culture piece for us as Soul Revival Church in Kirrawee in the Sutherland Shire was, in the early days, mainly aspirational. And so we were praying and looking for opportunities to reach out to other cultures. And I think that two things that churches can do in that aspirational stage is there's still this sense where there will be older and younger people in the church, and there's an opportunity for there to be sharing of theology from the older people and the younger people to be able to share some of their cultural understandings, even if the gap isn't that wide. But the other thing churches can do is build relationships with other churches, be partnering with other churches that they trust, that have the same theological why, have similar strategy, so that they might actually be able to invite the young people in those different churches to also input in and speak into the context they're in too. So there's two ideas anyway.
So can I just clarify what you're saying? So you're saying that kind of be ready to put the structure in place, even if you don't have the age that you're thinking you should have.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. It's like build towards it. Build towards where you will want to go. Yeah,
cool. That's a good way to finish. I
think.
Yeah,
okay.
That's the end of episode 1 for season 2 on the Shock Absorber, guys. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much, Stu. I'm really glad we're back on board, and we'll have plenty more to come out after this. So thank you very much.
It was a lot of fun. Thanks, Joel.
Thank you.